Welcome back to our conference, to our meeting on border fears in the Baltic between 1918 and 1991 during the so-called short 20th century. But tomorrow we'll see that we have a small extension looking a bit into the 21st one with the long shadows of the 20th century. As for now, we are going ahead chronologically in our visit back to the 20th century. We will have two presentations this afternoon. One about the 70s, not only, but starting in the 70s especially, by Dr. Ciprian Nit. I will introduce to you in a couple of minutes. And the second one will be by Dr. Paweł Miedziński, rather about the 1980s, in the period of comeback of Cold War, we could say, around atomic fears and atomic scenarios. So very interesting and sometimes even frightening subjects for this afternoon. The first one about de-escalation and the second one about potential escalation, all around fears, of course, fears, border fears. And of course, the question of borders can be understood here territorially, but not only. All of our participants, everyone in the audience, of course, too, has access to the chat. I tell this for the second part of each presentation when we open the floor to the discussion. So the modus operandi will be the same as so far. Each panelist will have 1 hour at his disposal, which means 20 to 30 minutes for the presentation, and then around 30 minutes or a bit more if necessary, and if possible, for discussion, comments, questions, and answers. As for now, I would like to introduce to you Dr. Ciprian Nit. Dr. Ciprian Nit is a lecturer at the Political Science Department of the West University in Timișoara in Romania. His main areas of academic interest are international political theory, especially cosmopolitanism, about which he has had several interesting publications. I will quote in a second. And he is also interested in international governance. He's the author of several articles published in academic journals and a book on cosmopolitanism published in Romanian. Among his publications, also in English, we have some proceedings of the International Symposium on Ideologies, Values, and Political Behaviors in Central and Eastern Europe. We have the book that I have mentioned. I won't take the risk to pronounce it in Romanian out of respect for your language, so I will please myself and our audience with the translation you gave of it. The title translated in English is Cosmopolitanism Towards a New Paradigm in Political Theory, published in 2014. Dr. Ciprian Nit will talk about the Helsinki process that started, the idea started in the late 60s and really got more precise at the beginning of the 70s. It was a very important process between East and West, of course, but as the name shows, it was set as for the geographical aspect in the Baltic Sea area, and that's not random. That has some significance, some meaning, not only for Finland, but I suppose Dr. Nit will tell us more about this. As for me, I switch off my microphone and my camera, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for this kind presentation. And first of all, let me thank you for this opportunity of being here and presenting and sharing my ideas with you. Before get started, I just want to make this that I'm trying to broaden somehow the view of the politics of space, politics of fear in the regions, So I'm begging for understanding on the part of you if my presentation is too broad or too theoretical. As our colleague in the morning, my paper is basically a theoretical one, but it's based on some empirical research also. As you well know, I'm not sure that the slide is starting.
As far as I can see, we see the first slide, the title.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Right. Now it started, so you can go back.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. So the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe was a critical moment in the détente of East-West relations during the Cold War, and it had a considerable impact on the Baltic space, the changing balance of power in the region being a frequent mentioned outcome of it. In my paper, I try to link the literature on Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or the Helsinki process. Basically, I use the two terms interchangeable. So I picked Helsinki process because it's short, and link the literature on Helsinki process with that on border fears in international relations. In doing that, I use Henri Lefebvre's theory of production of space to enlighten the role Helsinki process has played in the production of a new space in Europe and its relation with border fear in the Baltic region. As I said, the paper is mainly a theoretical one. However, I researched, and paper is partially based on empirical research. More precisely, I used the basic documents in the Helsinki process, the Helsinki Final Act, of course, and the concluding documents of the following up conferences in Belgrade, Madrid, and Vienna, and also other relevant official documents available at Wilson Center Digital Archive to see how politics of space is relating with the production of fear at the last stages of the Cold War in Europe. As regards the Helsinki process per se, it got a positive review in the academic literature, being considered a blueprint for ending the Cold War in Europe and a basis for establishing a new international order. The literature highlights the role it played in the détente of the confrontation between East and West, offering an ongoing forum for discussions, accepting the principle of self-determination and border status quo in Europe, creation of a regime of arms control, and the development of a regime of human rights in Europe, and also in its strive for solving issues such as migration, economic aid, or cultural cooperation between the participating states. Somehow implicit in literature, though, it is assumed that it also contributed to the reduction of fear on the continent. And indeed, we would agree that the Helsinki process contributed to the reduction of fear in the border regions of the Iron Curtain if we take into account the core elements of the political dialogue mentioned above: agreement on the border status quo, arms control, confidence building measures, ongoing political dialogue provided by the intergovernmental conferences. Concerning the Baltic region, the literature highlights all sorts of fear on both sides of the Iron Curtain, not only fears on the part of the West in the early decade of the Cold War of a possible Soviet invasion, disengagement of the US in Europe, nuclear war, intervention and domination in the borderlands, closure of intra-German borders, but also on the part of Soviet Union, such as fear of Western imperialism, fear of possible military confrontation with West over Oder-Neisse border, fear of independence movement and unrest in the Baltics, and later fears of a potential spillover of decommunization in the socialist bloc in the 80s. Also, as regards particularly the Baltic states, there was mutual anxiety on their status quo, the Western non-recognition and United States mainly non-recognition policy of Soviet sovereignty over the Baltic states bothered USSR great deal. On the other hand, Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik worried at a certain point in time both Western political leaders and Baltic exile communities that normalization of relation with Soviet Union would entail a recognition of the territorial status quo and the irreversible absorption of the Baltic states in the USSR. Literature on the role of the Helsinki process shows, on the other hand, how the Helsinki process lowered down those worries through the aspiring purpose of solving difference in diverse issue areas. My view is that in doing so, the Helsinki process, had the partially unintended consequence of eliminating difference, not only difference, but also difference in a social sense, contributing in the long run to the expansion of liberalism and of its way of life in Europe and worldwide. However, the Helsinki process contributed to the expansion of liberal political and economic values in a hegemonic way, and it can be viewed as a critical moment in the globalization of capitalism, or neoliberalization with a fancier term that is used today. And in doing so, it had a bivalent relation with fear. The Helsinki process contributed to the reduction of fear concerning the border status quo being probably one of the biggest. It has contributed to the reduction of fear as regards this border status quo, at least at the levels of leaders' perceptions, how can be seen the final act, declaration, for example. However, my paper is trying to show that Helsinki process has had in the long run the effect of inducing new fears, new anxieties associated with neoliberalism and today post-neoliberalism, not necessarily at the level of political leadership, but at the societal level also. And let me say some words about the theoretical framework, I mean the Lefebvrian critical theory that I use. As I have already mentioned, I use this critical theory of production of space, trying to connect the literature on Helsinki with literature on border fears. Lefebvre's theory has been used in diverse academic areas, from critical political economy, geography, architecture, urban studies, to critical theory of communication or critical legal studies. Also, Lefebvre's theory of politics of space has greatly influenced newer critical studies on neoliberalization, which are a source, a source of major influence for the present paper. And now we get to the most theoretical slide of the presentation. Sorry about that. In the paper, Lefebvre's theory provides, on the one hand, a critical basis for assessing the role of the Helsinki process in the new liberalization of European societies. On the other hand, it offers some conceptual and analytical tools convenient for discussing the link between the production of space and the production of fear in international relations. I use the term production of fear as mirroring the concept used by Lefebvre, production of space. So I coined the concept. Hope it doesn't bother you too much. Connecting the space analysis with the production of fear, I include Lefebvre's ideas in the following ways. Firstly, I put the elements of space analysis, such as form, structure, function, in connection with the production of fear in the context of Helsinki process. When we are speaking about form, in this context, international relation context, refers to the demarcation of borders. As Lefebvre says, the produced space has contours. It is circumscribed. These contours are both physical and conceptual, but they could interpenetrate with and superimpose on the borders of other produced spaces. Two kinds of borders are the most relevant in our case: national borders and the boundaries of geopolitical blocks in Europe. Second element, structure, refers to the relation between the whole and the parts of a given space. The northern hemisphere as a heterogeneous and conflictual space could be considered a macro space. The Helsinki process contributed in the long run to the opening of the two previously mutual exclusionary spaces and to the hegemonic, as I said, expansion of liberalism later, though in an uneven manner that gave birth to diverse specific expressions of it at the micro space level, that is the national and societal level. The Baltic region as a mesospace could be considered the border region where heterogeneous spaces of East and West have entered into contact, and it was a crucial space for the expansion of liberalism and a space that has a particular relation with fear, as the previous papers showed it very clear today and yesterday. And the third element, function, refers to the specific needs a specific space responds to. At the macro level, the production of a new international space in Europe during the Helsinki process should be put in connection with the need for security in the region, but also with the expansion, as I said, of liberalism, political and economic values. Not only liberties, but also a particular mode of production and reproduction of capitalist social relation at larger scales. At meso level, the Baltic space had its specific needs as a buffer zone related mainly to border recognition and self-determination. And at the micro level, the Conference for Security in and cooperation in Europe had served a long list of particular and divergent interests and needs formulated in spatial terms, from intensifying the East-West dialogue beyond geopolitical divisions in the case of neutral states as Finland, to protecting the Russian territorial interest in the Far East through getting recognition of the status quo at its western borders in Europe. So these are the elements of space analysis. Secondly, I used a conceptual triad that I found extremely interesting in Lefebvre theory, namely spatial practice, representation of space, and representation of space. I know it's quite difficult to make difference instantly about what do these concepts mean, which are the difference between them. But I will try to explain them. Spatial practices refers to international practices such as states as fixed units of sovereign space, domestic foreign polarity, states as containers of societies, practices dominant in the international system. Similarly, the representation of space conventional before the Helsinki process is space as territorial. Space is viewed as a series of blocks defined by state territorial boundaries. During and mainly after the Helsinki process, the international space starts to be viewed as structural, as the background where different geographical entities, regions, districts, nodes have special effects that result from their interaction or relationship with one another. So the Helsinki process made room for taking into account other scales, global, regional, local, besides the traditional nation-state scale. Under the heading representational spaces or spaces of representation, I looked at how the particular international context of the Helsinki process made possible a particular experience of space. Representational spaces are places that make possible particular representations of space or particular experience of space, and here also. And the whole Helsinki process could be considered such an institution that is basically a space of representation. And all the above mentioned elements of space analysis, form, structure, function, and the conceptual triad have been combined and put in connection with the production of fear in the Baltics. In Lefebvrian terms, the Helsinki process as an institution, as an international conference, could be considered a representational space that made possible specific practices and representations of Europe as a macro space where violence has been removed, contributing to the reduction of fear in the region. One spatial practice in international relations, particularly relevant here, is zoning of the international space. Zoning as an international spatial practice defines the form, structure, and function of the particular spaces we call states and geopolitical regions, or macro or meso regions, geopolitical regions. Zoning is a mechanism for codification of representations about space in international relations. And the dominant view on international space before Helsinki, as I said, was that of a series of blocks defined by rigid state territorial boundaries and geopolitical spheres. The Helsinki process made possible a different representation of space. It contributed to a flexible understanding of the borders, seen as a porous space, a soft space that allows the exchange of information, expansion of human contacts, development of transport and tourism, and so on and so forth. This view on the state border, as well as the commitment of the participating states to reducing tension in the higher policy area of security and disarmament, contributing to the limiting of fear in the region. I should also stress the fact that statist representation of borders, of course, stick to this statist representation of borders, that is the limiting of government sovereignty to the state borders, but this has been somehow minimalized during negotiations, as we can see in the final act document, in order to secure the continuation of those negotiations. This also contributed to lowering the anxiety in the region, however, not being tackled directly. Issues such as a possible reunification of Germany or Baltic states' independence created ongoing suspicions during the Helsinki process. Another issue is the right to self-determination. Is an issue that contributed to the spreading out of the liberal international system. The right of self-determination was included in the Helsinki Final Act and had a great significance for the Baltic states. Despite initial Soviet Union opposition, human rights and self-determination have been eventually included in the Helsinki Final Act. And so Helsinki process contributed in the longer run to the reconfiguration of the Baltic space, both structurally, namely former communist states becoming members of the Western Alliance, or at least a part of them, and functionally, former communist states have been integrated in the space of global capitalism. And in this process, of course, anxiety had a peak during 1991 with the declaration of independence of the Baltic states. So the Helsinki process contributed to the creation of a liberal international space. In doing that, it paved the way for transition in Lefebvrian terms from heterotopias to isotopia. The Iron Curtain imposed both physically and mentally two different macro zones in Europe. In Lefebvrian terminology, the spaces controlled by the Cold War combatants or counter spaces were heterotopias or mutually repellent spaces. We have practically ideological differences being transferred into oppositional and contrasting spaces in Europe after the Second World War. My interpretation is that Helsinki process created the conditions for the expansion of Western space and of its mode of production, and the socialist space had begun to be permeated by the practices of capitalism, even before communism collapsed in the late 80s, which brought it to the next level with the regime change and new liberalization process imposed socialism. So the Helsinki process was the institutional context that made possible new representations of space and new spatial practices. For example, one recurrent issue in the official documents of the Helsinki process is the participating states' engagement toward trade liberalization. So the previously divided space of West and East has been gradually permeated, and the former militarized areas, borders, and customs became progressively open spaces of dialogue and negotiations, conflict, hostilities, and diplomatic relations as activities that produced two opposed spaces during the Cold War gave way to a socialization process at later stages of the Helsinki process that contributed to the production of a new space of commerce, accumulation, and free trade in Eastern Europe and the Baltics. So that's why I consider the Helsinki process a crucial moment in the neoliberalization of space. It contributed to the end of the Cold War and the globalization of liberalism or capitalism. So the conference made possible this regional interpenetration of social spaces through the permeability of borders and proliferation of liberal values in economy, society, and politics. It contributed to the expansion of capitalist social relation and struggles over the former socialist space. It contributed to the replacement of conflictual production of spaces during the Cold War with one apparently not conflictual, and so contributed to the reduction of fear in Europe. And this newer space, of course, has been produced rather in a historical process that reached its momentum with the regime change in the socialist states. And as I said, the expansion of neoliberalism over the spaces of post-communist countries could be seen as a stage in the expansion of capitalism globally. And through that, it has an effect of containment, the fear in the region. So as capitalism or liberalism substituted the absolute space, this is the concept used by Lefebvrian, of pre-modernity, that is the space of privileges, of multiple prohibitions, the site of power and church that frightened individuals, being sharply different by the daily space of social activities. So it substituted this absolute space with the abstract space of modernity. This is also a concept used by Lefebvre. A space that is homogeneous and homogenizing at the same time, a space that contributed to the reduction of fear in social life. Now, in the context of the end of the Cold War, liberalism once again contributed to the reduction of fear through replacement of oppositional and confrontational spaces, heterotopias, and bringing them to the same denominator, isotopia. The process of globalization or neoliberalization in the Baltic area after the Helsinki process brought about political changes that minimized geopolitical fears. However, it yielded social changes with traumatogenic potential, at least during transition phase when new threats, unemployment, inflation, deterioration of living conditions, various dilemmas and dissatisfactions greatly affected post-communist countries. But during the neoliberalization of post-communist space, fear does not disappear altogether. Still, it becomes associated with new heterotopic places, which are spaces of alternate ordering, spaces organized in opposition with a space of accumulation, recently new heterotopic places emerged as a reaction to the hegemonic neoliberalization, such as terrorism, which was also an important topic on the Helsinki agenda in the 80s, transnational crime, networks, cyberspace, all contributing to the rising anxiety in international relations. Besides, if the Helsinki process has contributed to the reduction of fear globally by offering an institutional framework for lessening uncertainty, anxiety has not disappeared altogether during the process. There was a certain degree of concern on the part of socialist countries, as on the Western counterparts. And as a final note, this is the last idea. I hope I have 1 or 2 minutes.
Yes, for a concluding word, no problem. It's okay.
Okay. So a final note. I would like to mention one issue that I consider essential for the topic discussed. That is the Lefebvrian question of how can we move toward the idea of the production of space that is different. I mean, a truly appropriated space, a space of joy and enjoyment. Has the conference contributed to producing a space that is different, a space where fear and anxiety are missing or at least contained? The answer is mixed. It contributed to the production of things in space where both neoliberalism and socialism were meeting, and not to the invention of a new mode of production of space that will exclude fear and anxiety. It contributed to the reduction of global fear in Europe compared to the previous periods of Cold War. Still in the process of imposing neoliberalism, new anxieties have emerged, associated mainly with the process of globalization, anxieties that pervade today almost all areas of society, from economy to academia and culture. Okay, thank you. That was my presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nito, especially for the fact that your presentation, was a draft paper we got before, provides us, especially historians, with some very interesting analytic tools on a meta level, we could say, in a field where maybe sometimes, as it happens, historians are not always very confident about using theory to analyze historical process. But I think, however, this is a very valuable addition to historiographical methods, to the work on sources, which is of course essential. But all this theoretical apparatus you have provided through your contribution is indeed very interesting. I hope that there will be some field for discussion right now. I will have a couple of remarks, but again, I will first have a look at what the room has to say. I see that we have 2 participants, 2 panelists who want to add something or ask you something. Again, I'm not able to reconstruct who was first, so I propose we do it alphabetically. So Mrs. Natalia Iost first, and then Mr. German Aragol.
Yes, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I just probably wanted to add that there is the whole literature trend in international relations, and it was the beginning of the constructivist school in political science, because the first constructivists, they tried to explain the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they said that that was the Helsinki process that was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, because of a kind because of this mutual work of co-work between Soviet elites and the Western elites, there was a kind of process of approximation in the ideas and in the values, especially in these three baskets, in the basket of human rights. So that Helsinki process was the reason that Gorbachev started this politic of glasnost and perestroika. So I just wanted to add that this is actually absolutely central. And it was also the turning point inside the discipline, inside the political science, that the constructivist school appeared in it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, indeed, the social movements or civil society networks use the Helsinki Final Act to delegitimize the communist regimes that were against their people. Actually, thank you for your observation.
Okay, so I understand that we can go ahead with the next questions, Mr. Ragozin.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nitsu, for your interesting presentation, for refreshing the theoretical background, which is also useful for us historians, as Dr. Weber has stated. And the question may seem not that relevant towards the topic, but I will ask you that. So, according to the presentation, the Helsinki process accelerated the acceptance of neoliberal model for the border regions. On the other hand, does your methodology, your approach, take a look and take into consideration the thing that the unpredictable scenarios can take place in such kind of modal change? For example, how does that methodology work? How does that methodology work with the situations of conflict, both inside the society, international conflict, or even the state of war, as it obviously took place after collapse of the Soviet system? So how does your approach deal with such kind of cases? Thank you.
Yeah, I presume the model is suitable for analyzing those domains which are considered in the literature soft policy areas, and the conference, the Helsinki process, at least from the European perspective, I mean from a Western European perspective, was cooperation in the third basket of the Helsinki process, the basket of human rights, and also in the second basket, that was the basket of economic cooperation. The first basket, which was the hard power basket, was of interest mainly for the superpowers for the United States and Soviet Union. So somehow all the process changed if the great powers wanted in the beginning, as I said, quickly resolution of their problem. I mean, the status quo problem for the Russia and the disarmament for the United States. This agreement in Europe was not possible without the will of the Western European countries, mainly the members of the European Union back then. All the 9, I mean, yeah, at the beginning of the process, there were 6, but in the meantime, with the UK, Ireland, and Denmark accession, they were 9 at the moment of the signing of the Helsinki final agreement. So the Europeans were able to minimize those hard power, hard politics topics, and impose on the agenda low policy aspects, as I said, human rights, economical cooperation. And these are the most important aspects for building a link of identifying those areas of reciprocity between societies, economic and social, that are the medium where great changes can take place in the long run. And my focus was on these subtle processes of social and economic change that took place starting even with the 70s in Poland, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and that were accelerated in the 80s, and of course after the regime change in the countries of Central Europe and Baltic states as well. I'm not sure. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, I don't see any other questions, so I would like to take a chance and ask or add my comment. I would like to share one quote that your presentation made me think of, especially about the theory by Lefebvre, but from a previous time, let's say a decade before. I hope you can see the screen. Yes? Can you see the screen? It made me think of Henriksen and his definition of mental maps. In fact, the representation, about the representation of space more than space itself, and how this representation, this perception, plays a role always in decision making, foreign policy making, and so on. And in fact, as far as the Helsinki process was concerned, be at a large scale, East-West relations, or at the regional or micro bilateral scale between two interested actors or agents, each of them on another side of the Iron Curtain, for example, West Germany and Poland, or West Germany and one of the Central East European communist countries, for historical reasons. In fact, this Helsinki process was, we could say, something as well, something positive overall, from an overall view, but for those Eastern regimes, it was also a threat. Yes, because in fact the border fears had a very important role in their own domestic policy, and with the borders, be it spatially or ideologically, or at least through the context, the East-West context, economic context, also the borders become more and more porous, more and more not open, but still not that close as they used to be. The monopole of definition of what is a threat and what not, and who is the threat, became to be not that solid as it used to be for these regimes. We have these examples, for example, when you have the West German-Polish negotiation processes to sign in 1970 the so-called Warsaw Treaty, who was the first Western German act of recognition, provisory act, but still the first step to recognize the Western Polish border, the Oder-Neisse line, Oder-Nysa. And you have some memoirs by some Polish communist actors of these times, back in those times, where you have this these reactions within the Communist Party, where one member said, "Well, what will we be able to integrate society with if the German threat starts being not so valid? If our society sees that there are no tanks rolling on from West Germany to take back our recovered territory." So it's what happened maybe later when the enemy came to disappear. Yeah, and at the end of the process, at the beginning of the 19th, you have this well-known quotation that is attributed to several different actors, as usual when you have a very good bon mot or a good quote. When a Soviet diplomat told an American one, considering the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the USSR, "Well, we're making you the worst of the presents. We are taking away your enemy from you, so we won't have any enemy. So the lack of enemy can be a problem too." So at this point, the Helsinki process was also very important on the mental mapping, emotional mapping of space in Europe. In fact, through the change that it operated, the change that it introduced, and the reaction that it had to create on the side of the decision makers on both sides, in fact. So a process that, in fact, as we know, used to be initiated by the East as a kind of replacement of the overall peace conference that would have ended World War II, which the West would not accept because of the German issues. Then this initiative was hijacked, in fact, by the West, and it became dangerous for the East, as we know. And from this perspective, in fact, the border fears took a meaning. It was not only the existing fears about borders, but it was in fact a beginning fear of the lack of borders. It's an inverted one, yeah? And the porosity that you have explained, also the intersystemic porosity with the ongoing process of liberalization and neoliberalization of this very space, of course, and in general international relations through the 80s. This although we had a comeback of the second Cold War in the 80s for a while, but still this process was very well understood by the Eastern regimes that still were not able to structurally react to prevent the very consequences of this process. But this is more a comment on my part, and I was curious, maybe as far as your theoretical framework is concerned, whether you reflected also on this idea of mental maps, or whether this has been taken also by Lefebvre, or if Lefebvre has a position regarding this idea of mental maps as coined by Henriksson a decade earlier. Thank you very much again.
Thank you for your observations. Okay. Yes, at Lefebvre, borders or spaces, of course, are something very material. I mean, but they are. You can conceive them also as social construction. So they have a mental dimension, which is not ignored in Lefebvre. However, what I found very interesting in Lefebvre is his conception about space in general, and a border as a spatial space. In particular, space is created. That's a basic idea in Lefebvre, and we usually consider space as being something given, and that we are acting upon. But Lefebvre teaches us that we are the creators of the space, actually. And we are creating borders also as a particular and very thin space. So borders are a social construct, but they also have a hard materiality that we cannot ignore.
Oh, sorry. Now you can hear me. That's right. The construction of space, this constructivist approach is indeed very valuable also as far as space is concerned and borders, because it goes beyond the strictly, let's say, geopolitical conception, traditional or realist conception also of international relations. Of course, we have borders. Of course, we have territories, but the way they're represented is a social construction, of course, and it is negotiated. It's part of the way relations are developed between the agents. Thank you so much again. Well, I have a look once more in order to be sure and make sure I didn't miss anybody. No questions apparently among our panelists. I cannot see anything either on in the chat window. So I think that if you agree, or maybe you would like to add some final word, or if not, we can go ahead. So Mr. Nitu, is there something or a concluding word or sentence you would like to add with regard to your presentation?
Yeah, I was trying to to put this organization in a new perspective. I consider that after almost 50 years after the Helsinki final act, we can have a new look at the Helsinki process and its outcomes, and it seemed to me very interesting to try to connect its outcomes with the nowadays neoliberalization, which is a hot topic, let's say it that way. So maybe the paper will be Helsinki process revisited 50 years later.
Yeah, in fact, it's a point we will have to address by the end of our conference, the question of conference proceedings, or not so much maybe the idea of a collective volume, even with possibly additional contributions around this question. For sure, there will be a place enough for the theoretical framework, and for sure the reflections that you have proposed us will be, as I just said, very, very valuable for all of us. So thank you very much again.
Thank you, Tom.